A millionaire was losing his son, and not because of an illness. It was as if Mateo's strength was fading away every day. Until a poor boy, the son of the maid, approached him and said, "Your girlfriend won't let him walk." Alejandro looked at him in disbelief, and in that moment, everything changed. Before you start, subscribe to our channel to discover more stories like this and leave a like so you don't miss out on what's coming. Your girlfriend won't let your son walk. Diego's voice cut through the silence of the office like a gunshot. Alejandro, who was reviewing some contracts on his desk, looked up abruptly. The boy was there, trembling, breathing rapidly, his hands clenched around the cap he always wore. He hadn't knocked on the door. He hadn't waited for permission. He had simply walked in. "What did you say?" asked Alejandro, sounding more incredulous than angry. "What do you mean Camilla won't let Mateo walk?" "And she puts weird things in his food," repeated Diego, his voice breaking. Alejandro blinked, trying to process. Mateo, his 6-year-old son, hadn't been able to move his legs for 3 months. The doctors spoke of a possible neurological injury, something sudden with no clear explanation. Camilla, his girlfriend of a year and a half, had offered to take care of him personally and did so, at least in appearance, with tireless devotion. Diego began with a frown. "What you're telling me is very serious." "That's true," interrupted the boy. "I saw her when you were in the office. I came in to leave some drawings for Mateo. She was giving him some juice, and I saw her pour something from a small bottle. Mateo looked at me strangely, as if he didn't want to take it, but she told him that if he didn't, he would get worse." The clock on the wall ticked too loudly for his liking. Alejandro felt a knot in his stomach. Diego wasn't a child who made up stories, and the expression on his face wasn't mischievous, it was pure fear. Alejandro slowly got up from the chair. "Where's Camilla now? In Mateo's room," Diego replied, lowering his voice as if afraid that someone would hear. "But don't go in now if she knows I told you." The sentence hung in the air. Alejandro nodded and walked behind the desk. When he reached the door, he saw through the hallway that Mateo's door was ajar. A metallic flash glinted in Camilla's hand before she moved it out of sight. Alejandro's heart beat faster. Without thinking, he backed away and returned to the desk. "Diego, go with your mom to the kitchen. Don't tell anyone what you just told me. Understood?" The boy nodded, pressing his lips together, and ran out. Alejandro slumped into the chair. An image of Mateo Risueño running through the garden just a few months ago hit him like a cruel memory. What if Diego was right and that sudden illness was nothing more than a lie? A soft knock at the door brought him out of his thoughts. "Love." Camilla's voice sounded sweet as always. "Mateo is resting, don't disturb him." "Yes." Alejandro looked up, feigning a smile. "Of course." Camilla stayed a few seconds longer, watching him as if evaluating something before disappearing down the hallway. At that moment, Alejandro knew he had to check it out for himself. But not now, not when she could see him. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a small key, the one to the utility room where they kept cleaning supplies and medicines. If Camilla was hiding something, maybe he would find the first answers there. Before standing up, he heard footsteps again. They were lighter, more hurried. Diego returned, barely poking his head through the door. "Sir," he whispered, "I think she saw me talking to you." Alejandro didn't answer right away. He felt a chill run down his spine. Outside, a cloud covered the sun, and the light in the office grew colder. A bad feeling settled in his chest, and then he made up his mind. He would start watching her from today, without her knowing, without putting Mateo in danger. Alejandro didn't sleep well that night. The clock struck 3 in the morning when he found him, still awake, staring at the ceiling, Diego's words echoing in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scene of his son looking at that glass of juice with suspicion. At dawn, he decided he wouldn't confront Camilla. There was still something about the way she looked at him last night. That silent assessment made it clear to him that any hasty reaction would put her on alert. If he wanted to discover the truth, he would have to do it meticulously. He went down to the kitchen before everyone woke up. From there, he heard soft footsteps on the floor above. He recognized Camilla's gait. Camilla's, always deliberate, almost ceremonious. He didn't want her to see him, so he stayed behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the hallway, listening. "Good morning, my love." Camilla's voice was sweet, honeyed, ready for her therapy. He didn't hear Mateo's response, only the clattering of utensils. Utensils. Alejandro went back up the stairs silently. From the doorway, he watched. Mateo was sitting on the bed with his legs covered by a blanket. Camilla was holding a spoon in front of him, smiling. It seemed like a tender scene, but something caught his attention. Every time Mateo tried to lift his torso to get closer, Camilla gently pushed him back, murmuring something that Alejandro couldn't understand. He leaned against the door frame, pretending to be distracted. "Good morning." Camilla turned, smiled, and put the spoon down on the plate. "Honey, I was just giving Mateo his breakfast. He's a little down today." Mateo looked at him. It wasn't just any look. There was something in his eyes, a silent request that Alejandro couldn't quite decipher, but that disturbed him deeply. For the rest of the morning, Alejandro stayed close by, pretending to check his phone while following his every move. Camilla, aware of his presence, kept a loving tone and spoke softly to Mateo. However, there was a moment that shook him. Mateo dropped a napkin, and as he bent down to pick it up, his feet touched the floor. Camilla reacted immediately, placing her hand firmly on his shoulder. "No, no, no," Mateo said in a low but firm voice. "Don't force your legs, honey. You could hurt yourself more." Alejandro frowned, hurt himself more. The last medical report he had received did not indicate that trying to move his legs could worsen his condition. Later, when Camilla left to take a call, Alejandro approached his son. "Does it hurt when you try to move them?" he asked in a low voice. Mateo shook his head. "Then why did you start?" But the sound of footsteps in the hallway made him shut up. Camilla came back in, putting the phone in her pocket. "They were asking about the therapy center," she said with practiced naturalness. "I told them we're not going to change the treatment for now." Alejandro felt a pang of alarm. Last week, Camilla had told him that the therapy center had rejected her because they didn't accept her approach to natural medicine. Now, according to her, they were the ones who had called to offer continuity. Which of the two versions was true? He didn't say anything. He watched her as she arranged the blankets over Mateo's legs, humming a children's tune. Everything seemed fine, but he no longer trusted that image. In the middle of the afternoon, he decided to go out to run some errands. In reality, he stayed in the library, where he could see part of the hallway leading to Mateo's room through the reflection in the glass door. He saw Camilla enter and close the door behind her. Several minutes passed without a sound until he heard a quick murmur, as if she were talking on the phone. He couldn't make out the words, but he did notice that her tone was much harsher than the one she used with him or Mateo. When she finally came out, she had the same sweet air as always. "Mateo is already resting," she announced. "I'm going to make some tea. Would you like some?" Alejandro nodded with a controlled smile. He watched her walk toward the kitchen, her silhouette silhouetted by the evening light, and felt his mistrust grow. The contradictions were no longer just suspicions. They were beginning to form a pattern. That night, as he listened to Mateo's soft snoring from the hallway, Alejandro made a silent decision. If he wanted to find out what was going on, he would have to get much closer without Camilla noticing. The next day dawned with a gray light that seemed to foreshadow something. Alejandro ate breakfast in silence, watching Camilla prepare an infusion for Mateo. He noticed how she took care of every gesture as if she knew she was being watched. Shortly after, she approached the table with her usual smile. "I'm going to the market downtown," she announced. "I want to get some fresh herbs for Mateo's treatment." "Are you going alone?" asked Alejandro, trying to sound casual. "Yes, it won't take more than an hour." When the front door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the house changed. Alejandro waited a few minutes, then got up and went upstairs. The hallway was silent. From Mateo's room came the faint sounds of cartoons. "I'm going to check on a few things in the therapy room," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The room was at the back, next to Camilla's study. As he entered, the smell hit him. A mixture of rubbing alcohol and something else stronger, chemical that he couldn't identify right away. The walls were covered with shelves holding jars, bottles, and boxes of various sizes. On a wooden table lay open notebooks with notes written in small, cramped handwriting. He approached a low shelf. There in the dim light were several unlabeled jars. One was half full of a clear liquid, another of a very fine white powder. He picked one up and held it up to the light. The liquid seemed thicker than water. The smell was pungent, almost metallic. Looking for more, he opened a drawer and found folded invoices. They all had the same header: San Lucas Veterinary Clinic. Purchases of muscle relaxants in painkillers for animal use. The dates on the invoices matched the first weeks after Mateo lost his mobility. His heart was pounding. He looked back at the notebooks. They were notebooks with columns of dates and quantities. On some pages, next to the dates, there were notes describing increases in dosage, decreases in quantity, and observations such as slow response, tremors, and refusal to drink. A noise behind him made him turn around. It was Diego peeking through the door with a frightened expression. "Mr. Alejandro," he whispered. "I've seen her using that." Alejandro stared at him. "What do you mean she puts those things in Mateo's food and juice? She does it when you're not there or when she thinks no one is watching." The boy entered slowly, closing the door behind him. "At first I thought they were medicines, but once I saw how she hid them quickly when she heard me. Since then, I've noticed she does it almost every day." Alejandro felt a weight in his chest. Diego spoke softly but with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Weeks, I think. I think since Mateo stopped walking." Alejandro rested his hands on the table to contain his anger. He closed the notebooks and put the bill back where he found them, but memorized the exact location of each item. He couldn't let Camilla suspect that someone had searched the place. "Don't tell anyone what you've told me," he said firmly. "Not even your mom." Diego nodded seriously. Before leaving, Alejandro took one last look at the room. Every jar, every sheet of paper, every bill was a piece of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. And what he was seeing wasn't a treatment, it was something else. Something he didn't want to name yet. When he closed the door and returned to the hallway, he heard the sound of the key in the front door lock. Camilla had returned sooner than expected. He remained calm and went downstairs as if nothing had happened. "Are you back already?" he asked with a rehearsed smile. "Yes, the herbs were fresher today." She left the bags on the table and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek. "And have you been very busy?" "Quite," he replied, hiding the agitation he still felt. Reviewing some documents, the conversation ended there. But Alejandro knew that from that moment on, every minute would count. What he had found not only confirmed Diego's suspicions, but also pointed to a dangerous path he would have to tread carefully. Alejandro got up before dawn, his mind spinning in circles. The previous day's discovery left him no room to think about anything else. He had the bills engraved in his memory, every bottle, every word written in those notebooks. He knew he couldn't go on alone with his suspicions. He needed someone with medical knowledge, and above all, someone he could trust without risk of leaks. The answer came almost immediately to his mind. Dr. Valeria Ramirez, Mateo's pediatrician since his first months, a discreet and direct woman whom he hadn't seen since Camilla took complete control of the treatment, arguing that traditional medicine did not understand the nature of Mateo's problem. That same Dewajada, taking advantage of the fact that Camilla had left early for a meeting with suppliers, Alejandro made a brief but precise phone call. "Valeria, I need to see you. It's about Mateo." His tone must have sounded serious enough, because she didn't ask for details, just replied, "Tell me the time and place." They agreed that she would stop by the house under the pretext of a social visit. When she arrived, she was wearing a simple dress and carrying a folder under her arm. Her gaze, however, went straight to the point. "Tell me," she said as soon as she crossed the living room and sat down across from him. Alejandro took a deep breath. "I can't give you all the details yet, but I need you to examine Mateo as if it were a routine checkup. I don't want Camilla to suspect anything." Valeria looked at him for a second longer, assessing him. "Is there any reason to think that his condition is not what it seems?" Alejandro hesitated. He couldn't tell her about Diego or what he had found. "Not yet. I just have reasons to believe that we're not seeing the whole picture," he replied. She nodded slowly, accepting his answer. "Okay, if you don't want Camilla to find out, I'll do it quickly and without drawing attention." They went up to Mateo's room together. The boy was sitting on his bed drawing. When he saw Valeria, he smiled timidly. "Doctor," he exclaimed, surprised, "it's been a long time since you've been here." "I had to see how you were doing," she replied warmly. "Let's do a quick checkup, shall we?" While talking to Mateo about his drawings, Valeria discreetly placed a stethoscope on his chest, felt his legs, and checked his reflexes with gentle movements. She didn't take any visible notes, just memorizing each reaction. Does it hurt if I try to move your leg like this? She asked, gently bending the boy's knee. No. And do you feel this? She ran her fingertips along the sole of his foot. Mateo nodded. Alejandro watched her every move. He knew how to read Valeria's body language, and something in her furrowed brow told him she was detecting more than she was saying. When they were done, she stood up with a smile. Mateo, keep drawing pretty things. I'm going to talk to your dad for a minute, Dad. They went out into the hallway. Valeria lowered her voice. Alejandro, I can't make a definitive diagnosis without tests, but there are signs that don't fit with sudden paralysis due to injury or neurological disease. What signs? His muscle tone is decreased, but there is no total loss of sensation. In addition, her reflexes are altered in a way that reminds me of poisoning by certain compounds. Alejandro felt a chill down his spine. Poisoning, yes, prolonged. I'm not talking about something that happens in a day. This takes time, weeks, maybe months. They looked at each other in silence for a few seconds. Valeria knew that something serious was going on, even though Alejandro hadn't given her all the details. Can you confirm it? He asked. I'll need to take samples and send them to a trusted laboratory. And I repeat, if you don't want Camila to know, we'll have to do it very carefully. Alejandro nodded. No, I don't want her to suspect anything. Not yet. Valeria took a deep breath. Okay, get me an appointment when she's not there. I'll bring the material for the samples and have the lab receive them as part of a routine study. Before leaving, she warned him again. If I'm right, Alejandro Mateo isn't just sick. They're making him sick. When the door closed behind her, Alejandro felt the house grow colder. These were no longer just vague suspicions. There was medical evidence pointing to something much more sinister. And with that came the risk that any false move could put Mateo in immediate danger. The change began as a silent current, barely perceptible, but Alejandro picked it up. The days following Valeria's visit were marked by a new feeling in the house, as if the air had become thicker. Camilla continued to smile, speaking in a sweet voice and caring for Mateo with apparent devotion. But there was something different in her eyes, a spark of calculation, as if every gesture was being measured for a purpose she did not voice aloud. The first clear sign came on a Monday afternoon. Alejandro returned to the mansion earlier than expected. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and when he opened the door, he heard a soft murmur coming from the upstairs hallway. He went up quietly, following the voice. Mateo's bedroom door was ajar, and through the crack he saw Camilla sitting very close to him, leaning toward his ear, speaking in a low, firm tone. He couldn't make out the words. However, what caught his attention most was the way Mateo kept his eyes fixed on the blanket over his legs, as if he didn't want to look her in the eyes. "Oh, I didn't know you were back," said Camilla when she saw him straighten up suddenly. Her smile appeared a moment later, too quickly to be genuine. "The meeting ended early," replied Alejandro, but trying to sound carefree. "Everything okay here?" "Perfect. We were just chatting for a while." Mateo looked up for just a second, and Alejandro thought he saw a flash of discomfort in his eyes. He didn't insist, but the image remained etched in his mind. From that moment on, Camilla stopped delegating Mateo's care. If before the employees could help with breakfast, clothes, or therapy, now she was the one who took on all those tasks from start to finish. She justified it by saying that it was better for his progress that one person be in control of everything. But it wasn't just Mateo who was under stricter control. With the staff in the house, her attitude became more cutting. She checked the cleaning with excessive thoroughness. He corrected Diego's mother for minor tasks, and on more than one occasion sent her to run errands outside the property for no apparent reason. The effect was clear: to reduce the chances of anyone being left alone with Mateo. One night, while they were both looking over some papers in the living room, Alejandro decided to test the waters. "I've been thinking," he said, looking at a document as if it were a casual comment. "Maybe we should take Mateo to a rehabilitation center, a place with more specialists to get a more complete picture." Camilla looked up slowly, as if weighing each word she was going to say. "Specialists," she repeated. "You don't trust what I'm doing for him." The question had an edge that couldn't be disguised. "It's not that," Alejandro replied in a calculatedly neutral tone. "I just think that more opinions might help." She put the pen down on the table with a small thud. "Alejandro, I've been here every day taking care of him, keeping his spirits up. making sure he gets what he needs. Do you know how hard it is to keep him stable at the office? The comment was laden with more than simple exhaustion. Alejandro looked at her calmly, maintaining his posture. I'm not questioning your efforts. I just think that if there is an alternative that could speed up his recovery, we should consider it. Camilla held his gaze for a few seconds that seemed longer than they were. Then she stood up slowly, gathered her papers, and headed for the stairs. I want what's best for him too, she said without turning around. Don't forget that. Alejandro followed her with his eyes until she disappeared upstairs. The silence that remained in the room was not the usual silence of quiet evenings. It was thick, uncomfortable, as if the conversation had marked an invisible boundary. In the days that followed, that tension became more evident. Camilla began to carry a small notebook with a dark cover that she consulted constantly and never left within reach of anyone. She used it to write down schedules, meals, and details of Mateo's routines. Although he suspected that those pages contained much more than simple records. Even when Mateo went out into the garden, she stayed a couple of steps away, watching his every move. If Diego or his mother approached, Camilla found some excuse to intervene, either offering juice or saying that Mateo needed to rest. Alejandro, aware that he was under observation as much as his son, moderated his behavior. He couldn't show anxiety or haste because that would confirm any suspicions Camilla might have. But internally, the pressure was growing. With each passing day, she seemed more alert and more possessive, as if she knew there was something he wasn't telling her. And although Alejandro didn't show it, he was beginning to feel that the margin for maneuver was shrinking dangerously. Evening had fallen over the mansion with a heavy air charged with that golden light that tinges everything with melancholy. Alejandro, sitting in his office, had tried to immerse himself in reviewing some contracts, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the last few days. Camilla's subtle, constant surveillance of Mateo, her controlling attitude toward the staff, that conversation in the living room that had left an invisible wedge between them. He needed a break, not from the house, but from her presence, which seemed to inhabit every corner. And there was one place where they rarely crossed paths, the library, a spacious room with high ceilings where dark wooden shelves held books that Alejandro had inherited from his father. Camila avoided it. She said the smell of old paper made her feel suffocated. Her disinterest made it the perfect place to think without interruption and perhaps to search. He pushed open the door, and the smell of leather, dust, and aged wood enveloped him like a cloak. The light filtering through the curtains was dim, revealing particles suspended in the air. He walked slowly between the shelves, letting his fingers brush against the spines, reading titles he hadn't touched in years. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but for days he had had a feeling that was difficult to explain, that there were more secrets in that house than anyone could imagine. And if there was a place where they could be hidden, it was there. His hands paused on a thick volume with a worn green binding and the title engraved in gold, Chronicles of the City and Its People. He took it out carefully. Its weight told him it had been on that shelf for decades. He opened it at random, letting the yellowed pages rustle. Then he saw it. A small bulge interrupted the uniform thickness of the paper. Between two chapters, barely protruding, was the corner of a photograph. He gently pulled it out, taking care not to bend it. What it revealed he left untouched. In the image, younger but unmistakably Camilla. Her hair fell in waves darker than now, and she smiled at the camera with a relaxed, almost triumphant expression. She was wearing a simple summer dress, and her hands rested on the shoulders of a boy about 7 years old. The little boy wasn't smiling. His large, dark eyes looked at the camera with a strange mixture of resignation and emptiness. On either side of Camilla were two men, one tall, impeccably dressed, with a serious expression. The other, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, wore an expensive watch that glinted in the light of the photograph. None of them looked familiar to him. Alejandro turned the photo over. The back was blank. No date, no place, no names, nothing. However, something about the composition of that image made his stomach churn. Camilla was in the center, literally joining the three figures as if she were the connecting point between the men and the child. And the way she held her hand on the little boy's shoulder didn't seem just protective. There was something possessive, territorial about it that didn't fit with the image of tenderness she showed towards Mateo. He swallowed hard the whole time he was with her. She had never mentioned those men or that child. Never. And yet, here they were frozen in a moment in the past, hidden between the pages of a book that no one ever looked at. He remained silent for a few seconds, listening to the rapid beating of his heart. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was something impossible to ignore. If that photo was what he thought it was, then Mateo wasn't the first, maybe not even the second. He put the book back in its place, making sure it was exactly as he had found it. The photograph, however, he kept in the inside pocket of his jacket. If Camilla had hidden it there, she must not know that he had found it. When he left the library, the hallway was empty. The silence in that wing of the house contrasted with a distant murmur coming from the living room. He recognized Camilla's voice, cheerful, talking to Mateo as if they were watching something funny on television. That contrast, that warm voice now, and the woman in the photo with that look that seemed to claim the child as her own, sent a chill down his spine. As he walked towards his room, he felt the weight of the photograph against his chest. It wasn't just an old piece of paper. It was a piece of a much bigger puzzle, a clue that confirmed that what he was not an isolated story, but part of a pattern that had probably been repeated before. And who knew how many more times? And for the first time, Alejandro understood that what he was facing could be more dangerous than he had imagined. Alejandro spent most of the night awake, sitting in the dim light of his room with the photograph in his hands. The dim light from the lamp highlighted the faded brightness of the paper. He had studied the features of the two men over and over again, trying to find some memory, some social event or business meeting where he had seen them. Nothing. They were completely unfamiliar faces. Still, something about their bearing told him that they were not ordinary people. Both radiated a kind of confidence and authority that is not easily acquired. The man in the suit had an almost institutional demeanor, while the man in the rolled-up shirt conveyed the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to moving in exclusive circles without asking permission. He needed information. The man in the suit had a nearly institutional bearing, while the one with the rolled-up sleeves conveyed the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to moving in exclusive circles without asking permission. He needed information, and he needed it fast. The police were not an option. Any official investigation would put Camilla on alert. He had to turn to someone who worked in the shadows, someone capable of moving pieces without leaving a trace. Mid-morning, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Vargas," a deep voice answered on the other end. "Martín, I need a favor. A big one." Martín Ruiz had been head of private security at one of Alejandro's complexes. He had retired a few years ago, but he maintained a network of contacts ranging from detectives to corporate investigators. He arranged to meet him at a discreet cafe far from the mansion. The meeting was brief and to the point. Alejandro slid the photograph across the table. "I want to know who these two men and this child are. Everything. Names, backgrounds, connections, whatever you can find." Martín looked at the photo carefully, lingering longer than usual on Camilla's face. "And her," he asked. "I know her. What I don't know is what she was doing with them." Martín nodded without further questions. "Give me a few days. Don't use your phone to talk about this. I'll get in touch." For the next 72 hours, Alejandro lived in silent tension. Camilla seemed to have returned to a lighter version of herself, less rigid, but Alejandro knew it was just a facade. Every smile and every kind word only served to remind him that he couldn't let his guard down. The call came on a Thursday night. "I have something," Martín said bluntly. "It's not pretty." They met at the same cafe. This time Martín arrived with a folder, opened the first pages, and pointed to a more recent photo of the man in the suit. His name is Gilberto Áñez, a businessman. 5 years ago, his 8-year-old son lost the use of his lower body. The case was unusual. The doctors couldn't find a clear cause. Shortly after, the boy's mother divorced and disappeared from the map. Alejandro felt a chill. Martín moved on to the image of the man in the shirt. "This is Esteban Cruz, a high-profile lawyer. Similar story. His orphaned nephew, who was in his care, suffered a sudden degenerative disease. The boy ended up in a private institution." Alejandro clenched his jaw, and the boy in the photo, Martín shook his head. "I haven't identified him yet," but he pulled out another sheet. "I found this. Both Año and Cruz were on the guest list for a charity event 7 years ago. And guess who else was there? Alejandro took the sheet. It was a newspaper clipping. In the lower corner, dressed in an elegant black dress, was Camila smiling with a glass in her hand. The air in the cafe seemed thicker. Alejandro remained silent, processing. It wasn't just a coincidence. There was a pattern. Men with resources, a minor in their care who ended up incapacitated in suspicious circumstances. And Camila was always present. Martín looked at him seriously. If you're going to pursue this, you had better do it very carefully. These connections are no accident, and she's not acting alone. Alejandro nodded, put the documents in an envelope, and tucked it under his arm. Back at the mansion, he crossed the hall with controlled steps, aware that every gesture had to appear normal. From the living room, Camila's voice called him in a light tone. "You're just in time for dinner." Alejandro smiled mechanically and approached, but as he sat down at the table, the envelope in his jacket felt as heavy as lead. Now he had proof that he wasn't being paranoid. What he had discovered was part of something much bigger and darker. The morning began with a deceptive, almost artificial calm. Alejandro was in his study reviewing some reports that failed to hold his attention. From there, the distant echoes of domestic routine reached him like a murmur. The clinking of dishes in the kitchen, soft footsteps going up and downstairs, the faint music of a children's program in Mateo's room. Everything seemed normal until silence suddenly fell. It wasn't the usual silence of a large house, but a tense one that seemed to be waiting for something. Alejandro put the pen down on the desk and went out into the hallway. As he climbed the stairs, a brief, muffled groan stopped him. He pushed open the door to the room and found Mateo lying there, pale, his lips slightly dry and his hair stuck to his forehead with a thin layer of sweat. His breathing was irregular, and each inhalation seemed like an effort. Mateo Alejandro rushed over, placing his palm on his forehead. "You're burning up, son." The boy opened his eyes just enough to look at him, murmured something unintelligible, and closed them again. The heat emanating from his skin confirmed that he had a high fever. Camila was standing nearby, her expression carefully calibrated, concern visible but not alarming. "He's been like this since last night." She said, "Don't worry, it's normal. The body is eliminating toxins." Alejandro looked at her in disbelief. "This isn't normal. He has a high fever and can barely stay awake. Don't be dramatic, Alejandro. I'll keep a close eye on him, and in a few hours he'll be better," she replied with a gentleness that sounded more controlled than calm. He wasn't going to argue. He turned on his heels and went down to his office. He took out his phone and dialed Valeria's number. "I need you to come right away," he said without preamble. "Mateo is not well." 15 minutes later, the pediatrician was climbing the stairs quickly, carrying her briefcase. She greeted Camilla with a brief smile and leaned over Mateo, speaking to him in a soft voice. "Hello, champ. Let's see what's wrong." She took his temperature, saw him, checked his reflexes, measured his blood pressure, and listened to his heart and lungs. She mentally noted every reaction, every gesture. "Has he eaten anything different in the last 24 hours?" she asked without taking her eyes off Mateo. "No," Alejandro replied immediately. "The usual," Camilla interjected. "Vegetable soup, herbal tea, and natural juice." Valeria didn't comment, but her gaze hardened. She took a few steps away from Alejandro and turned to Camilla. "No," Alejandro replied immediately. "The usual," Camilla interjected. "Vegetable soup, herbal tea, and fresh juice." Valeria didn't say anything, but her gaze hardened. She stepped aside with Alejandro toward the hallway. "This isn't a common fever," she said in a low voice. "The drowsiness, muscle weakness, and skin color. I need to do more thorough tests." "What tests?" "A complete toxicology panel, liver and kidney function tests, and some neurological studies. If there's an external agent affecting his system, it will show up," Alejandro frowned. "We can do it without Camilla knowing." "Yes, but it has to be now. If we wait, the values could change and make detection more difficult." They returned to the room. Valeria addressed Camilla in a professional and calm tone. "With this fever, it's best to do a general checkup to make sure there's no serious infection. It's just routine." Camilla hesitated but nodded. Valeria opened her bag and began to prepare the equipment. She drew blood with a precision that was almost invisible to Mateo, who barely reacted. She also collected a small urine sample. Everything was carefully stored in an airtight case. "All done, champ. That didn't hurt, did it?" said Valeria, stroking his hair. As she said goodbye, she turned to Alejandro. "I'll call you as soon as I have anything," she whispered. "Don't let the fever go up anymore." The door closed behind her. Alejandro sat down again next to the bed. Mateo slept restlessly, his eyelids trembling slightly. Camilla remained there silently stroking his hair. "You'll see, he'll be fine tomorrow," she said without looking at him. Alejandro didn't answer. He knew that phrase wasn't meant to be comforting. It was a veiled warning. And for the first time, he felt that every hour that passed brought them dangerously closer to a point of no return. The next day dawned gray and damp, as if the weather knew that something heavy was about to be revealed. Alejandro had spent the night going in and out of Mateo's room, taking his temperature every hour, checking his breathing. The fever had gone down a little with cold compresses, but the boy was still restless. Alejandro had spent the night going in and out of Mateo's room, taking his temperature every hour and checking his breathing. The fever had gone down a little with cold compresses, but the boy was still weak and sleepy, his eyelids heavy as if they were filled with stones. The sound of the phone broke the silence. It was 9 in the morning. Alejandro answered immediately. "It's me." Valeria's voice sounded more serious than usual. "I have the results." He felt his stomach tighten. "Tell me, not over the phone, we have to meet." They agreed to meet at a small office that Valeria used outside the hospital, a discreet place with no staff or patients that day. Alejandro left clear instructions to Diego's mother not to leave Mateo alone for a second. Camilla, she said, was going out to look for some special herbs. The drive to the office seemed endless. When he arrived, Valeria was already waiting for him with a folder on the table. Her expression left no room for doubt. What she was about to say would not be easy to hear. Alejandro began by opening the folder. The tests were conclusive. Mateo's blood and urine show consistent levels of a muscle relaxant normally used in veterinary medicine. The air grew thicker. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely, it's not a lab error. The concentration we found could not have come from an accident or casual contact. This is the result of continuous and controlled administration." Alejandro rested his hands on the table. What exactly is she doing to him? This type of compound depresses the nervous system and muscle function. In prolonged doses, such as those we detected, it causes progressive weakness, loss of mobility, and if continued, it can affect vital organs. The words prolonged doses echoed in his mind like hammer blows. It was the confirmation he feared and needed at the same time. Valeria looked at him seriously. "This didn't start yesterday. Based on the levels, he's been taking small amounts for weeks, maybe months. That's exactly how long ago you mentioned his loss of mobility." Alejandro felt a lump in his throat. Everything he had seen, Diego's suspicions, the bottles in the therapy room, Camilla's attitude, everything fit into a picture as clear as it was unbearable. "What do we do now?" he asked, holding back his anger. "First, we need to get the exposure immediately. Second, we need to start a supervised detoxification and rehabilitation process. And third," Valeria paused, "Alejandro, this is a serious crime. You can't handle this alone." He leaned toward her. "I'm not going to allow him to be around my son, but I need solid evidence before I act so he can't deny it or get away with it." Valeria nodded. "With the results I have, we can already document the case. I'll keep copies in a safe place and also give you one for yourself. But be careful. If this person suspects that you know the truth, he could try to do something more serious." Alejandro took the envelope with the copies of the tests. Its weight in his hands was different. It wasn't just paper, it was the certainty that his son was being slowly poisoned and the responsibility to do something before it was too late. Back at the mansion, he paused for a few minutes in his car, parked in front of the entrance. From the window, he saw Camilla crossing the hallway, talking on the phone, smiling. That everyday image now seemed like a mask perfectly rehearsed to hide what she really was. He clutched the envelope against the seat. The time to move cautiously was coming to an end. Alejandro knew that from the moment he left Valeria's office with the test results, every gesture, every word, and every silence in front of Camilla had to be calculated. He couldn't show the slightest sign that he knew the truth. If she detected a crack in his performance, the situation could become unpredictable. When he entered the mansion that afternoon, Camilla was in the living room leafing through a magazine, her legs crossed and a steaming cup of tea on the table. She looked up and smiled. "You're early," she said. "Mateo, he's in his room watching his cartoons." "Perfect," Alejandro replied with practiced calm. "I could use some time with him." He climbed the stairs with a steady gait. In the hallway, he ran into Diego, who was carrying a pile of clean clothes. Alejandro discreetly signaled for him to stop for a second. "I need your help with something," he whispered. "Don't say anything to anyone, not even your mom." Diego nodded immediately with the seriousness of someone who understood the gravity of what was being asked of him. Alejandro continued on to his study, where he put the envelope with the test results in a locked drawer. Then he opened a small briefcase he had brought that morning. Inside were several recording devices, tiny cameras, and motion sensors. That night, after dinner, he waited for Camilla to retire to her room to install the first of the devices. He placed the most important one in the kitchen, at an angle that covered the countertop and the table where Camilla usually prepared Mateo's meals and drinks. He hid the second one on a high shelf in the therapy room, camouflaged among jars and boxes. The third was installed in the dining room, facing the place where Camilla frequently used her phone. The following days were a test of self-control. At the table, Alejandro kept the conversation light. He asked about the plants in the garden, about the supposed herbs Camilla bought, or about the latest book she said she was reading. He felt her, smiled, and even made small comments to appear interested. Meanwhile, every night he checked the recorded material in his study. On the third night, he got what he was looking for. In the kitchen video, Camilla was seen pouring a clear liquid from a small jar into a juice glass. She didn't look around. Her gesture was mechanical, like someone repeating a routine so many times that she no longer felt the need to be vigilant. Alejandro paused the video, fast-forwarded a few minutes, and saw her place the glass on a tray with some cookies and leave the frame. In another recording, taken from the dining room, Camilla was sitting with her phone pressed to her ear. "Today's dose was complete," she said in a low but clear voice. "No, she hasn't shown any resistance." "Yes, I'll keep it at the same level for now." There was a pause and her expression changed to a brief smile. "I understand. When the time comes, I'll make the adjustment." She hung up and went back to leafing through a magazine as if nothing had happened. Alejandro rewound the video, listened to it again, and memorized every word. He didn't know who was on the other end of the line, but there was no doubt that she wasn't acting alone. He saved the copies to an external hard drive and hid it in a safe place outside the house. When he returned to the living room, Camilla was there getting ready. He looked up and smiled at her. "Would you like a cup?" "Sure," he replied in the same calm voice as always. As he watched her pour hot water over the leaves, he knew that the real game had barely begun, and that to win, he would have to continue playing this game of masks without letting her suspect that he was already losing. The afternoon progressed with calculated calm. Camilla had spent much of the day moving between the kitchen and the garden, always with Mateo by her side, supervising every detail of her routine. Alejandro watched her from time to time from the hallway or through a reflection in the windows, maintaining the same relaxed and cordial expression he had adopted since he learned the truth. Normality was now his necessary disguise. In the study, the ticking of the wall clock marked a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Alejandro was reviewing some papers when he heard 3 quick knocks on the door. "Come in." Diego entered and closed the door behind him with a hurried gesture, as if afraid that someone would see him there. His breathing was agitated and his eyes were wide open. "Sir," he whispered, "I just heard something I think you need to know." Alejandro put down his pen and leaned toward him. "Tell me exactly what happened." "I was taking some clean towels to the guest room when I passed by Mrs. Camilla's room, and the door was ajar. I could hear her talking on the phone, but I stood still because what she said sounded strange to me." Alejandro remained silent, letting the boy continue. He said, "The final dose has to be this weekend." He said it just like that. Then she was silent, as if listening to the other person. Then she replied that yes, there would be no problem because you were going to be busy. The words hung in the air between them. Alejandro felt a chill run down the back of his neck. "Did you hear any names? Any clues as to who it was?" No, but when she moved inside the room, I saw the phone number appear on the screen. I memorized it. Are you sure you memorized it correctly? Alejandro asked, surprised by the boy's quickness. Yes, sir. I repeated it several times in my head until I got here. Diego recited the digits slowly, making sure not to make a mistake. Alejandro wrote them down on a piece of paper, then folded it and put it in a drawer that he locked. You did very well, Diego, he said in a firm and grateful tone. But listen, you can't mention this to anyone, not even your mother. The boy nodded seriously, understanding the weight of the warning. Then he left the office, closing the door gently. Alejandro stood there for a moment, looking at the folded piece of paper. He knew it wasn't a number he usually called from home. He hadn't seen it in the phone records, and it wasn't saved in any of his contacts. Everything pointed to it being a number that couldn't be easily traced, perhaps a prepaid number. He took out his personal phone, one he didn't use for business, and dialed Martin Ruiz, his trusted contact in private security. Martin's deep voice answered on the second ring. Vargas, I have a number, said Alejandro, his voice sounding drier than he expected. I need you to find out who it belongs to, and any information you can get is urgent. Send it to me, Martin replied, without asking for an explanation. I'll let you know as soon as I have something. Alejandro hung up and put his phone away. He walked over to the window of his study and through the glass saw Camilla crossing the garden. She was holding her phone and smiling as she talked. The image would have seemed harmless to anyone else, but he now saw it as a carefully played role, a facade under which something definitive and dangerous was being planned. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with rehearsed normality. At dinner, Alejandro talked about trivial matters: the weather, the menu, a possible business trip. Camilla responded naturally, although her gaze drifted toward Mateo with an unsettling frequency. Alejandro played his part with precision, but inside he had already made up his mind. That phone number was a direct line to the other side of the game. And now, for the first time, he felt he had in his hand a string he could start pulling to find out who was behind it. Before the final dose became an irreversible threat. The night before had been long. Alejandro remained seated in the darkness of his study long after the rest of the house had fallen silent. On the desk lay 3 items that were now key pieces of evidence: the USB stick with the videos from the hidden cameras, the piece of paper with the phone number Diego had memorized, and the old photograph found in the library. He knew that each of these objects was one step closer to unmasking Camilla, but it was also a latent risk if she found out he had them, so he decided to act immediately. At 12:17 a.m., he sent an encrypted message to Martin. Tomorrow I need a meeting, include B. The reply came just a minute later. 8:30 in the morning, same place. That small, somewhat hidden cafe on a cobblestone street in the old part of town had always seemed like a good place to talk without raising suspicion. The dark wooden tables, the aroma of freshly ground coffee, and the low murmur of customers made it a refuge where conversations were lost amid the sound of cups and spoons. Dark wood, the aroma of freshly ground coffee, and the low murmur of the customers made it a refuge where conversations were lost among the sound of cups and spoons. Alejandro arrived before anyone else. He was carrying a black briefcase, discreet with everything he had gathered so far. While he waited, he looked out the window at the quiet street, thinking about how each step had to be taken with surgical precision. Martin appeared on time in his gray raincoat with a folder under his arm. He had that look of a man accustomed to seeing the worst in people without being surprised by it. Shortly after, the cafe door opened again. Dr. Valeria entered, dressed soberly, without excessive makeup, and with a medical folder under her arm. They greeted each other with a brief handshake and took a seat in a secluded corner. We have to get going, Alejandro began bluntly. He opened his briefcase and placed the USB drive and a copy of the sheet with the phone number on the table. Valeria looked at him with a seriousness she made no attempt to hide. What did you find out, Martin? The investigator took several papers out of his folder. The number is a prepaid line. It's not listed in any regular customer records, and it's associated with the recurring calls to 2 other similar numbers. This pattern is not for personal use. It's for coordination. It's a network that communicates without leaving a trace. That fits with what we've seen in the videos, said Alejandro, sliding the memory stick toward Martin. There you have everything. Camilla tampering with the food, measuring doses, and talking on the phone about what is clearly a plan. Valeria, who had already reviewed some of the material days earlier, leaned forward. This gives us something solid, but not enough to close the case. If we catch her in the act, she won't have any way out. Martin settled into his chair and spoke calmly. We can provoke her, create a situation that will cause her to act thinking she won't be observed. But it must be done in a controlled manner with Mateo out of danger. Alejandro nodded, a fake absence. I'll make her believe I have to leave on a last-minute business trip. If she thinks I'm not here and that Mateo will be alone with her, she'll probably try to give him the next dose. Valeria intervened with precision. I'll be inside the house, in a place where she can't see or hear me. As soon as I see her act, I'll intervene immediately. We can't let her get anything to Mateo. Martin added, I'll put 2 people from my team watching the entrances to the house. We'll also install a couple of additional cameras to cover blind spots. If she tries to escape, we'll lock her in before she reaches the front door or the back exits. The trio spent the next hour fine-tuning every detail, the exact time Alejandro would leave the house, the spot where Valeria would position herself to have a direct view of Mateo's room without being detected, the location of the team's vehicles so as not to arouse suspicion, the signal Valeria would give to start the operation. Alejandro reviewed the plan one last time, looking for any cracks. The most important thing was that she didn't smell anything strange. If she suspected anything, she could postpone it or change her method, and that would leave us right where we are now. Before getting up, Martin picked up the memory stick and Valeria put the copy of the action plan in her medical folder. The tension was palpable, but so was the determination. That night at dinner, Alejandro spoke naturally, as if nothing had changed. Between a comment about the weather and an office anecdote, he slipped in the information. Tomorrow I have to leave early for a foreign client. I don't know if I'll be back before nightfall. Camilla looked at him with a neutral expression, although her eyes seemed to light up briefly. I understand, Mateo and I'll be fine. That simple answer left Alejandro with the feeling that the first domino had fallen. The next would be the moment when she believed she was alone and safe to act. The morning of the operation dawned with a clear sky and a cold air that had seemed to foreshadow something. Alejandro got up before dawn, not out of habit, but because he had barely slept. He dressed calmly, measuring each movement, and when he went down to the kitchen, he found Camila preparing breakfast. Today will be a long day for me, he said, pouring himself some coffee. I'll have to leave after lunch, and I don't know if I'll be back before nightfall. She looked at him with an understanding smile. Don't worry, everything will be fine here. That simple phrase had a different meaning for Alejandro. Now, as he drank his coffee, he mentally reviewed the choreography they had rehearsed the previous afternoon. Valeria was already settled in a side room with a partial view of Mateo's room, and Martin's team had set up cameras and additional devices in the kitchen and hallway. The 2 backup agents remained in discreet vehicles parked half a block away, ready to enter when they received the signal. Lunch went off without a hitch. Alejandro got up, checked some papers in his study, and shortly after 2 o'clock he said goodbye, casually. The sound of his car engine driving away was part of the deception. A few meters away, he turned down a side street and parked in a position where he could receive the signal from the equipment and enter within seconds. Inside the house, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Mateo was in his room watching his favorite show. Diego was helping in the kitchen. Camilla, with her leisurely gait, gathered various ingredients on the countertop. A soup already prepared in a small pot, a bowl, a spoon, and a jug of juice. Diego, following Alejandro's instructions, pretended to go get a clean cloth from the laundry room, but left his phone in recording mode on a shelf with a direct view of the table. His heart was beating so fast that he felt the sound could give him away. Camilla took a small glass jar and a thin syringe out of her robe pocket. Without looking around, she drew up a clear liquid and with precise movements poured it into the soup. She stirred slowly, making sure it was completely mixed in. Then she put the bottle back in her pocket and placed the plate on the tray next to the juice. Diego, from the hallway, captured everything on video. His breathing was so restrained that his chest hurt. He barely moved while Camilla, satisfied, headed to Mateo's room with the tray in her hands. That was when Valeria's voice came through the communicator that Martin was wearing. Confirmed, he's administering the substance. Proceed. In a matter of seconds, the main gate opened with a loud bang. Alejandro entered, accompanied by two police officers and Martin. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway like a sentence. Camilla, surprised, turned toward them with the plate still in her hands. "What does this mean?" she exclaimed, trying to remain calm. Alejandro approached her and, without taking his eyes off her, took the tray and placed it on a nearby table while one of the officers secured the bottle found in her pocket. "It means it's over," he said with icy firmness. The police read her rights while Martin put the bottle in an evidence bag. Diego appeared in the hallway, still holding the phone in his hand, and handed it to Alejandro. "Everything is recorded," Camilla whispered, and when she saw herself surrounded, she dropped her mask of calm. Her gaze hardened and her lips curved into a brief, joyless smile. "You think you won," she muttered, "but this doesn't end here." Alejandro didn't respond. He watched her as she was escorted to the exit, aware that this threat could mean much more than it appeared. As soon as the police vehicle drove away, Valeria quickly checked Mateo and confirmed that he had not ingested anything. Alejandro allowed himself for the first time in weeks to let out a long sigh, but the tension had not yet dissipated. He had only taken a decisive step in a game he knew was not yet over. The air inside the mansion was thick. Camilla, still flanked by the two officers, walked with tense steps toward the main exit. Alejandro followed her at a safe distance, never taking his eyes off her hands, aware that any sudden movement could mean a desperate attempt. When they reached the lobby, one of the policemen turned to open the door, and it was at that moment that Camilla acted. With a sudden movement, she pushed one of the agents and ran toward the left side of the property. Her shoes pounded the stone floor as her robe fluttered like a fleeing white shadow. "Stop her!" shouted the other officer, running after her. From the back, Diego heard the commotion and peeked out just in time to see her turn the corner toward the side gate. Without thinking twice, he ran towards the security control panel. His fingers flew over the buttons, activating the automatic locking system of the perimeter gates. The metallic sound of the mechanism echoed throughout the property, a dull thud followed by an electric buzz. In seconds, the heavy side gate leaves descended and locked into place with a firm click. Camilla arrived just in time to see the escape route sealed off in front of her. She pounded the metal with both hands. She turned and found the agents running toward her. The first one grabbed her by the arm, but she struggled with unexpected strength, uttering broken words. "You don't understand. I'm not the only one," she shouted, trying to break free. The second officer handcuffed her, making sure to keep her held by the shoulders. Alejandro arrived at that moment, breathing heavily from the run, and stopped a few steps away. "What do you mean you're not the only one?" he asked, keeping his voice firm. Camilla turned her head toward him with a crooked smile. "This is bigger than you can imagine, but you won't have time to find out everything." One of the police officers urged her to walk toward the vehicle. As she was being escorted, she muttered names and places between broken sentences. Alejandro, who was walking close enough, managed to catch two full names and a city. Martin, who had arrived at the scene after making sure the area was secure, took out his phone and began writing down every word that came out of her mouth. In the struggle, Camilla tried to stop, but the officers forced her to continue. "They're coming for you," she managed to shout before they gently pushed her into the back seat of the patrol car. The front gate opened and the police vehicle slowly drove away. Alejandro stood in the driveway, watching Camilla's figure disappear behind the reflection of the flashing blue lights. At his side, Diego exhaled the breath he had been holding. "She didn't get away," he said, almost as if to confirm it to himself. Alejandro put a hand on his shoulder. "Today you closed more than just a gate, Diego." As silence slowly returned to the property, Alejandro and Martin exchanged glances. They had names, a clue, and a certainty. What Camilla had hinted at was not an empty threat. What was behind it could be even more dangerous than what they had just faced. Dawn brought a heavy silence, broken only by the constant ringing of Alejandro's phone. These were not ordinary calls. Each vibration corresponded to coded messages from Martin or notifications of progress in the operations. He had slept little, and yet his mind was more awake than ever. Adrenaline kept him going. At 6:15, the first message from Martin appeared on the screen. Confirmed. All teams in position. Order signed. Today is the day. Alejandro replied with a terse understood and headed to his study. There on the desk, he had prepared everything he would hand over to the authorities the night before. Folders sorted by date, paper and digital copies, photographs, call logs, screenshots, and the USB drive with the key recordings. Folders sorted by date, copies on paper and in digital format, photographs, call logs, screenshots, and the USB drive with the key recordings. At 9 o'clock sharp, Commissioner Ramirez arrived at the mansion accompanied by Officer Hernandez, a specialist in organized crime. They both entered with a firm step, but with the discretion that the case required. Alejandro led them directly to his study. "Here's everything," he said, pointing to the file box he had placed on the table. "Physical evidence, digital backups, and a detailed index of each item. It includes Dr. Valeria's statement, my security team's records, and the transcript of the conversation Diego overheard." Ramirez skimmed through the main folder, nodding silently. "With this, we can come down hard on them. This morning, arrest warrants were issued for 4 people directly linked to Camilla. We have 2 others under investigation, and more could be added as we review what you've given us." While the final legal details were being finalized in the studio, the operation was getting underway in different parts of the country. In the capital, a tactical team stormed a luxury apartment on the 7th floor, where they arrested a man identified as the network's financial liaison. In the north, agents surrounded an isolated ranch that served as a warehouse, an improvised laboratory for the substances used. On the coast, an elegantly dressed woman was arrested in a cafe. Witnesses described her as unperturbed as she was escorted to the police vehicle. Martin, who was coordinating communications from a middle point, sent quick updates to Alejandro. "Target 1, secured. We found documents with more names. Target 2, arrested. We seized substances, coast clear. Third arrest confirmed." Each message was a blow against the structure that had put Mateo's life at risk. Around noon, the first leaks reached the media. National networks interrupted their programming to report on the dismantling of a criminal network that operated in several provinces and specialized in incapacitating underage heirs of wealthy families. The images showed boxes of evidence, confiscated laboratory equipment, and police vehicles leaving the raided properties. The faces were pixelated, but Alejandro knew who they were. He watched the broadcast from the living room, remote control in hand. Diego, who was sitting next to him, asked cautiously, "That's what they did to Mateo. That's what we did so that no one else goes through the same thing," Alejandro replied, without taking his eyes off the screen. Dr. Valeria arrived in the afternoon with a folder under her arm. "All the test results are now in the hands of the prosecutor's office," she reported. "The compounds found in Mateo match those found in other minors in similar cases. There is no way they can deny it." The police chief, still present to coordinate the chain of custody of the evidence, confirmed that in the next few days, the preliminary hearings would begin. "What you turned over gave us the push we needed. This could have gone on for years if it weren't for your decision to act." Alejandro nodded, but inside he knew that true satisfaction would not come from seeing the guilty parties in handcuffs, but from seeing Mateo healthy and free from threats. That night, the television repeated the images of the operations on a loop. Outside, the city went on as usual, oblivious to the silent change that was taking place. Upstairs in his room, Mateo slept soundly, breathing calmly. Diego, sitting in a chair next to the bed, looked up when Alejandro entered. "I think tonight we'll be able to sleep," he said quietly. Alejandro smiled slightly, and for the first time in weeks, felt that those words might be true. The net was coming down piece by piece, and although they couldn't claim victory yet, at least they were no longer moving in the shadows with the impunity they had enjoyed before. The mansion had changed. It was the same imposing structure with its high ceilings and large windows, but the air was different. The feeling of constant surveillance no longer weighed heavily, nor was there that invisible coldness that Camilla had left behind. Now the silence was not suffocating. It was a peaceful silence, like a necessary pause after a storm. Mateo spent his first 48 hours in the clinic under intensive medical care. Dr. Valeria had been adamant. His system had to be cleansed before any other intervention. The room was bathed in soft light, and the constant hum of the monitoring machines accompanied the boy's every breath. Alejandro, sitting in a chair next to the bed, didn't move except to get closer when Mateo opened his eyes. "I'm here," he said in a low voice every time the little boy looked for him. "I won't leave you alone." The treatment began with constant hydration through IV fluids, carefully measured supplements, and hourly checkups to monitor blood pressure, temperature, and neuromuscular response. Mateo barely spoke, but his eyes remained fixed on his father's every gesture. The first week was slow. There were days when Alejandro felt that progress was almost invisible, but Dr. Valeria reminded him that in cases like this, every tenth of an improvement counted. When the test finally showed a noticeable decrease in toxin levels, Valeria gave the green light for physical therapy. On the morning of the first exercise, a child rehabilitation specialist entered with a multicolored ball and a thick mat that she spread out in a corner of the room. "Today we're going to help your legs remember how to move," she announced cheerfully. Mateo watched her cautiously, but when Alejandro gave her a slight nod, he agreed. The boy tried to place his feet on the mat. His muscles responded stiffly, as if every movement took twice as much effort as it should have. The physical therapist encouraged him patiently, and Alejandro at her side held a small towel to wipe the sweat that quickly appeared on his forehead. Aware that recovery would be long, Alejandro completely reorganized his life, delegating responsibilities at his company, canceled trips, and converted a room near Mateo's room into his makeshift office. There was no longer anything more important than his son's progress. The arrival of Diego and his mother Teresa at the mansion marked another significant change. Teresa, with steady hands and a serene gaze, took charge of the kitchen. Every dish that came out of there was designed not only to nourish Mateo, but also to motivate him to eat. Diego, for his part, became a constant and stimulating presence. He brought board games, suggested little competitions, and offered to accompany Mateo in his exercises almost naturally. "When all this is over," Diego said one afternoon as they tried to complete a puzzle together, "let's run in the garden, but this time you're going to win." Mateo's laughter, though brief, filled the room and echoed down the hallway. Alejandro, who was reviewing some documents in the makeshift office, stopped writing and stood listening. That laughter was a reminder that the battle was not over, but that they were gaining ground. As the days passed, the calendar ceased to be a simple marker of dates and became a record of achievements. 10 minutes sitting up without help, 2 steps leaning on the walker, a whole afternoon without pain in the legs. Every advance, no matter how small, was celebrated as a collective triumph. The mansion, which had once been a scene of surveillance and deception, was slowly being transformed into a living home, filled with voices, aromas, and the tangible promise that Mateo was regaining not only his health, but also the childhood that had been taken from him. Night had enveloped the mansion in a thick silence. From the study window, Alejandro watched the reflection of the streetlights on the driveway and the slight movement of the branches swaying in the wind. In his hands, a cup of tea that had already grown cold. He hadn't turned a single page of the documents in front of him. His mind was too busy elsewhere. In another time, in his memory, Sophia was still alive. He saw her in the kitchen of the old house, dressed in a light robe, her hair tied back in a makeshift bun, and that warm smile that seemed to have the power to make everything make sense again. He remembered the scent of her perfume mingled with the smell of coffee in the mornings. He remembered her voice, always patient, even on difficult days. The memory inevitably turned towards the end. The illness had arrived like an unwelcome visitor, settling in without warning. The first symptoms seemed harmless, but within months, doctor's appointments became daily and the prognosis increasingly bleak. At that time, Alejandro clung to any hope, any experimental treatment, any chance of reversing what already seemed inevitable. When Sophia left, his whole world was reduced to a single axis, Mateo. His son was the reason he got up every morning and the anchor that kept him going. But that total devotion also left him open, vulnerable, eager to find someone to help him bear the weight of life without Sophia. It was in that emotional crack that Camila entered with her soft words, her professional attitude, and that apparent willingness to take care of Mateo as if he were her own. Alejandro now understood that need for support had been his blind spot. It wasn't pure naivety, but a desperate desire to believe that he could trust someone again. A soft sound brought him out of his thoughts, small footsteps approaching down the hall. The study door opened slightly, and Mateo appeared in his blue pajamas, his hair slightly tousled. "Dad, aren't you coming to bed?" Alejandro set his cup on the desk and stood up. "Of course, champion. Let's go." They walked together, and on the way, Alejandro realized that Mateo's slow, controlled steps were already a remarkable improvement from weeks ago. They entered the bedroom and the boy settled under the sheets. "Were you working?" Mateo asked. Alejandro shook his head and sat down next to him. "I was thinking, remembering your mom." Mateo looked at him curiously and with a touch of nostalgia. "I remember her," he said. "I liked it when she sang to me before bedtime." Alejandro smiled, although he felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, she had a beautiful voice, didn't she?" "The best," Mateo replied confidently. Then they began to remember together. They talked about the Sundays when Sophia made pancakes, the afternoons when she took him to the park, and how she made up stories with talking animals. Alejandro described the details and Mateo filled in the scenes with what he remembered from his childhood. Between the two of them, they reconstructed moments that seemed to bring her back, even if only for a moment. When the silence returned, Alejandro took his son's hand. "Mateo, I want you to know that no matter what happens, we will always be together. No one and nothing will ever separate us." The boy nodded and his eyelids began to close. Within minutes, he was fast asleep with a peaceful expression that Alejandro hadn't seen in a long time. He stayed by his side for several more minutes, watching him breathe. Each breath was a reminder of why he had endured so much and why he could never let his guard down again. When he finally left the room, the hallway was in darkness and the silent house seemed to carefully guard that moment of intimacy. Deep in his heart, Alejandro knew that the shadows of the past would remain, but he also understood that it was those same shadows that reminded him day after day of what was at stake. The morning began with a soft glow coming through the curtains of the rehabilitation room. The sun filtered through the light fabric, drawing irregular shapes on the padded floor. Mateo was sitting on a mat with his legs stretched out in front of him. The physical therapist, a woman with a calm voice and steady hands, crouched down beside him. "Today, we're going to try something different," she announced, placing a small ball in front of Mateo's feet. "You don't have to move it much, just enough to move it in a little." Mateo nodded with a mixture of nervousness and concentration. Alejandro stood in the corner watching every detail, while Diego remained by the door with his arms crossed and a restrained smile. The first attempts were timid. Mateo pressed his lips together and stared at the ball, but his feet barely moved. The physical therapist encouraged him with short phrases calculated not to put too much pressure on him. Alejandro felt every second as if it were an eternity. He could feel how his son was gathering all his energy to execute a movement that for any other child would be almost automatic. Then it happened with a visible effort. Mateo bent his right knee slightly and pushed the ball a few inches. It was a minimal gesture, but enough to fill the entire room with a different energy. "Did you do it?" exclaimed Diego, stepping forward. "Kick, you did it." The boy looked at him in disbelief, as if he wasn't sure what had just happened. Then a shy smile appeared on his face. Alejandro crouched down beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "It's just the beginning, son, but it's a great beginning." Mateo tried again, this time with his left leg. The movement was less firm, but he managed to roll the ball a little further. The physical therapist took note with satisfaction. "This is real progress. It means the muscles are responding." Diego couldn't contain himself and with an impulsive gesture raised his hands as if celebrating a goal. "I told you were going to win the race in the yard someday." Mateo's laughter was soft but genuine, and Alejandro felt something inside him relax. For weeks he had lived in constant tension, focused only on surviving the next day. Now for the first time, he was thinking about the future. When the session ended, Alejandro and Diego helped Mateo back to his room. The boy was tired, but there was a different sparkle in his eyes, as if he had discovered a door he thought was closed. Later, while Mateo rested, Alejandro stood on the terrace looking out at the garden. He thought about how his outlook on life had changed in such a short time. Before, his days were filled with meetings, figures, and projections. Now, true success was measured in centimeters. The movement of a leg, his son's laughter, the security of knowing he was safe. Everything else could wait, he murmured to himself. convinced that every second he spent with Mateo was a more valuable investment than any business deal. The Palace of Justice building stood imposing that morning with a line of cameras and reporters stationed at the main entrance. Since dawn, the media had set up a cordon to cover what was already shaping up to be one of the most high-profile trials of the year. Alejandro, accompanied by his lawyer and Dr. Valeria, arrived discreetly through a side entrance, avoiding the commotion. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Camila, sitting next to her defense attorney, wore a simple dress and neat hairstyle, trying to project serenity. However, her hands clasped together on the defendant's table betrayed her constant tension, her knuckles white, her fingers moving in small spasms. The prosecutor opened with a forceful presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is not just a case of child abuse, but the tip of a criminal network that crosses borders and destroys families for power and money." Over the next few hours, key evidence was presented. Hidden camera recordings showed Camilla tampering with Mateo's food. Medical tests signed by Valeria detailed the systematic presence of veterinary muscle relaxants. Purchase receipts from specialized stores, along with intercepted messages, left little room for doubt. One of the most shocking moments came when Diego took the stand. In a steady voice, he recounted how he had seen Camilla add substances to the food and how he had managed to record part of these actions on his phone. His testimony, although brief, was met with heavy silence in the courtroom. The prosecutor also presented evidence obtained from the names Camilla had mentioned during her arrest. Documents and bank records showed that she was not acting alone, but as part of a network with ramifications in at least 3 countries. Although it was not the focus of the trial, this information reinforced the seriousness of the case. The defense tried to argue that it was all a conspiracy motivated by personal and financial disputes, but every testimony and every document contradicted that narrative. In his closing argument, the prosecutor addressed the jury directly. "Today you have the opportunity to send a clear message that manipulation, abuse, and violence against the most vulnerable will not go unpunished." After 2 days of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Camila Ruiz was sentenced to 25 years in prison for child abuse, attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Alejandro did not show an expression of triumph, but rather one of relief. He knew that the conviction did not erase what had happened, but at least it ensured that she would not hurt anyone else. He knew that the sentence did not erase what had happened, but at least it ensured that she would never hurt anyone else again. In the that followed, driven by what had happened, Alejandro began to actively collaborate with organizations dedicated to combating child abuse. His personal experience made him a visible and committed advocate, able to speak not only from theory, but from experience. He participated in talks, funded protection programs, and became involved in awareness campaigns. Although his motivation remained Mateo, he discovered that he could also help other children and families avoid what he had suffered. It was, in a way of closing a circle, transforming pain into action. Autumn had painted the mansion in warm tones. Golden and reddish leaves fell slowly, piling up in corners of the garden, which for months had been a silent setting, almost symbolic of the forced pause in Mateo's life. Now, however, that same space seemed to beat with a different expectation. The light of the afternoon fell obliquely, bathing the lawn in a soft glow. The cool air brought with it the scent of damp earth and dry leaves. Alejandro was standing next to the wooden bench under the big oak tree with his hands in his pockets, watching Mateo take his place at one end of the path, accompanied by the physical therapist. "Remember, you don't have to hurry," she said step by step, "and always look ahead." Mateo nodded, and for a moment Alejandro felt as if the entire garden had fallen silent to witness what was about to happen. Diego stood to one side with a smile on his face and his cell phone in his hand, ready to record. Mateo's first step was unsteady, wobbly, but he managed to keep his balance. The second came with a little more confidence. Alejandro felt his chest tighten. Every movement was the result of weeks of effort, discipline, and a courage that could not be measured in words. When Mateo reached the middle of the path, the physical therapist stayed behind. The boy looked up, and his eyes met his father's. Alejandro felt that moment contained everything: the loss, the struggle, The fear, but also the recovery, the strength, and the love that had kept them together. "You can do it, son," he whispered. Although he knew that Mateo didn't need to hear him to know it, the steps continued, slow but steady, until finally Mateo crossed the distance that separated them. Alejandro knelt down and welcomed him into his arms, lifting him up with an impulse full of emotion. Tears ran down his cheeks, but he didn't try to hide them. "You did it," he said, his voice broken. "I knew you would, Diego." From the side, Diego applauded, unable to contain his joy. When Alejandro looked at him, his eyes conveyed a gratitude that needed no words. "Thank you, Diego, for everything," he said in a tone that came from the depths of his heart. The garden that months ago had been a silent scene of worry and fear was now filled with laughter and an energy that seemed to sweep away any remaining shadows. Alejandro, still holding Mateo, allowed himself to look around and realize that although the road had been hard, they had arrived at a place from which they could look forward with hope. The golden light of the sunset intensified, and the falling leaves seemed to swirl in a slow dance on the lawn. Alejandro closed his eyes for a moment, recording that image in his memory. When he opened them, he smiled. The past no longer held them back. The present was theirs, and the future was open. Justice had been done. Life was moving forward again, and the bond between them was stronger than ever. Thank you for joining us until the end of this story. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where in the world you are watching from.